There's a kind of silence in the hollows of eastern Kentucky that isn't empty. It's full of sounds too faint for strangers to hear. In 1882, in a valley that doesn't appear on any map, 7 women sat at 7 looms from 4 in the morning until dark. They wove cloth that merchants praised in 3 counties. But none of those merchants ever asked why the weavers never came to town. And none of them heard what finally happened to the man who kept them there. The hollow was called Blackwood Creek on the few deeds that mentioned it at all. You wouldn't find it unless you were already lost. The trail dropped from the ridge through a cut so narrow that 2 men couldn't walk side by side, and it ended at a clearing where the Calloway property sat between 2 slopes that blocked the afternoon sun. The main cabin was built from chestnut logs grayed to the color of old bones, but the barn was what mattered. Ezra Calloway had converted the barn 15 years earlier, and now it was known only as the loom room. The windows were small and set high in the walls, and they faced inward toward the clearing rather than out toward the ridge. That was intentional. You could stand outside and hear the rhythm of the treadles and the clack of the shuttles, but you couldn't see who was making the sound. The merchants from Manchester and Hyden didn't visit the loom room. They met Ezra at the crossroads, paid for the cloth, and carried it away. None of them asked about the women who wove it. The property had no near neighbors. The closest cabin was 4 miles south, and the family there had stopped visiting after Ezra's wife died. You have to understand what kind of place this was. The Appalachian Mountains in 1882 were not part of the country in any way that mattered. There were no telephones, no paved roads, no sheriff who made regular rounds. The law was what the nearest men with rifles decided it was. A man who wanted to hide his daughters from the world had only to choose the right valley and cut the trail behind him, and Ezra Calloway chose well. Ezra was 54 years old in the winter of 1882, and he had lived all but 3 of those years within 10 miles of the loom room. He was tall, with shoulders bent from decades of bending over frames, and his hands were the color of walnut stain from the dyes he mixed himself. His eyes were the pale blue of creek water over limestone, and people who met him at the crossroads remembered them because they never seemed to blink during conversation. He had married at 20 a woman named Clara who gave him 7 daughters and died delivering the last one on a February night so cold that the midwife's water bucket froze solid before dawn. The daughters were named Mercy, Ruth, Esther, Naomi, Leah, Martha, and Abigail. Their mother lived long enough to name the last one, but not long enough to watch her take a first step. Ezra didn't remarry. What he did instead came 3 years after Clara's death, during a fever that kept him in his bed for 11 days. When the fever broke, he told his daughters that God had spoken to him. He said the Lord had appeared in the smoke from the wood stove and commanded him to weave cloth for the righteous. He said the daughters were divine instruments, provided by heaven for this purpose, and that their hands were consecrated to the shuttle. They must never marry, because a husband would defile the consecration. They must never leave the hollow, because the world was full of corruption. And they must never stop the work, because every thread was a prayer, and every bolt of cloth was a shield against the sin that crept like mist through the mountains. The oldest daughter, Mercy, was 13 when he said this. She believed him because she had no reason not to. Her mother was dead, her father was the only authority she had ever known, and the Bible he read from was the only book in the house. The younger daughters believed because Mercy believed, and Abigail, the last one, had no memory of her mother at all. For her, the loom room was the only world that had ever existed. Ezra sold the cloth 4 times a year at the crossroads, and he brought back salt, flour, seed, and the necessities the hollow couldn't produce. By the standards of the mountains, he was prosperous. His cloth was finer than what most families wove for themselves, and merchants paid extra for the evenness of the weave. That prosperity was proof, in Ezra's mind, that God endorsed his arrangement. A poor man might doubt his calling. A man who sold cloth for hard silver had his answer. But you didn't see Ezra at night, when the merchants were gone and the loom room was lit by tallow candles that spat and guttered. You didn't see him walk between the looms with his Bible open, reading aloud while his daughters worked. You didn't see the willow switch he kept hung from a peg near the door, or the way his eyes moved across the room, as if he were counting souls as well as bolts. The loom room held 7 looms, 7 stools, 1 wood stove, and a shelf where Ezra stored the shuttles and reeds. The daughters slept in a loft above, reached by a ladder that Ezra could pull up behind him. There was 1 privy behind the barn, and 1 water pump that froze in January and ran brown in March. That was the extent of their world. Mercy was 28 in 1882. She had been weaving since she was 9, and she could read a draft pattern the way other women read hymnals. Ruth, 26, had the steadiest hands. Esther, 24, could thread a loom in the dark. Naomi, 22, never made the same error twice. Leah, 20, hummed while she worked, though she didn't know she was doing it. Martha, 18, was the quickest learner, and Abigail, 16, still looked up from her shuttle sometimes as if she expected to see someone standing in the doorway who wasn't there. Their day began at 4 in the morning, when Ezra rang a cowbell outside the barn. They dressed in the dark, climbed down the ladder, and took their places at the looms before the first light came over the ridge. They worked until Ezra judged the light too poor to continue. They ate at their stools. Ezra brought them cornbread, fatback, and beans on a wooden tray, and they ate with one hand while the other kept the shuttle moving. On Sundays, he called a halt at noon so he could deliver a sermon. Then they wove again until dark, because Sunday rest was for the worldly, and his daughters were consecrated. The cloth they produced was genuinely beautiful. The dyes came from walnuts, indigo, and madder root that Ezra gathered from the creek bed. A bolt of Calloway cloth could last 20 years without fraying. What the merchants didn't see was the cost. The daughters' fingers were swollen at the joints, and their shoulders had developed a permanent forward tilt from leaning over the frames. Ruth had begun to cough in the winter months, a dry hacking sound that echoed between the looms. Esther's eyes had weakened until she could no longer thread a needle without holding it 6 inches from her face. These were the normal wages of the trade, but they were being extracted at a rate that no loom should have demanded. And yet the daughters didn't complain, because they didn't know they had a right to. That barn was the only world they remembered, and Ezra's voice was the only authority they recognized. Ezra's theology was simple, and that was what made it effective. He told them that every thread they passed through the reed was a prayer that rose directly to heaven. Every bolt of cloth they completed was a shield that protected the righteous from the sin that infected the world beyond the hollow. When they wove, they were weaving salvation. When they rested, they were inviting damnation. He read from the Bible while they worked, choosing passages about obedience, about children honoring their fathers, about work as virtue and idleness as sin. He skipped the parts about setting captives free. His voice became part of the rhythm of the room, another mechanical sound like the treadles and the shuttles. The daughters heard him without listening, the way you hear rain on a roof. But the theology had a practical purpose that went beyond spiritual control. It solved the problem of escape. If the world was corrupt and the loom room was holy, then leaving wasn't just disobedience. It was apostasy. It was a choice for hell. Mercy, at 28, had never seriously considered walking down the trail toward the ridge, because the trail led to sin. Ruth had never imagined marriage, because marriage would defile her consecrated hands. The cage didn't need locks, because the bars were built from Scripture. When a daughter made an error in the cloth, Ezra's correction was swift. He used a willow switch, thin enough to whistle through the air, and he struck the back of the legs or the shoulders. He never hit the hands. The hands were consecrated, and they had to keep working. He would recite a verse while he did it, usually something about the Lord chastening those he loved. The error would be cut from the bolt and burned in the stove while the daughter watched. Then she would return to her loom and weave the section again, this time correctly. The change began with Martha. She was 18 in the summer of 1882, quick with her hands and quicker with her mind. She knew every draft in the room, and she could look at a half-finished bolt and tell you exactly how many passes remained. She also knew, in the way that only another weaver could know, when a pattern had been reversed. In late August, Ezra delivered an order for a merchant in Manchester. Martha was working a bolt of indigo twill that was supposed to carry a standard herringbone pattern. On the third day of the bolt, she reversed the sequence on a single repeat, creating a mirror image that was visible only to someone who knew what to look for. The error was tiny, no more than 2 inches across, and she covered it with correct weaving on either side. No merchant would have noticed, but Naomi noticed. Naomi was 22, 2 looms away, and she had been watching Martha's hands with the idle attention of someone who has spent 10,000 hours in the same room. She saw the reversal happen. She saw Martha's fingers hesitate for half a second, almost too brief to measure, and then continue as if nothing had changed. Naomi said nothing. She kept her own shuttle moving and filed the observation away. That night in the loft, after Ezra had locked the barn door from the outside, Naomi crawled across the straw to Martha's pallet and whispered, "I saw." Martha was awake. "What did you see?" "The herringbone. You turned it." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I could," Martha said. And that was the entire answer. Naomi didn't report her. She didn't tell Mercy or the others. What she did instead was more dangerous. She began watching, and Martha was only the beginning. She watched the way Ezra hung the willow switch, the way he locked the door, and the way his hands shook when he took his medicine before bed. She watched the pattern of his days the way she watched a draft, looking for the repeats, the breaks, the places where the structure could be altered. The reversed herringbone remained in the bolt. It was sold to the merchant in Manchester, and no word ever came back to the hollow. But the damage was done, not to the cloth, to the pattern of obedience that it held for 15 years. A single thread had been pulled out of place, and now the whole weave was weaker where the break had occurred. In October of 1882, a circuit-riding preacher named Silas Vance came through the hollow. He was a thin man in a black coat patched at the elbows, and he traveled between the isolated cabins with a Bible and a bedroll. Ezra met him at the trailhead. He welcomed Silas Vance to the Calloway property with a hospitality that he never showed his daughters, and he offered to show him the loom room. Vance accepted because he was tired and the afternoon was growing cold. He followed Ezra across the clearing to the barn, and he heard the looms before he saw them. But when Ezra opened the door, Silas Vance stopped on the threshold. 7 women sat at 7 looms. They didn't look up. They didn't stop working. Their hands moved in the half-light of the high windows, and their feet worked the treadles, and the shuttles flew back and forth. The room smelled of wool and sweat and tallow. It was warm, but the warmth felt thick, almost solid, as if the air itself had been woven too tightly. Ezra announced the visitor with a satisfaction that bordered on pride. "These are my daughters, and they're consecrated to the Lord's work." Vance looked at each face in turn. He had seen poverty and hardship in every form the mountains could produce, but he had never seen 7 adult women in a single room who would not meet a stranger's eyes. He walked between the looms, close enough to touch the cloth on the nearest frame, and he noticed that the weaver flinched when his shadow fell across her work. "You keep them busy," Vance said. It was the only thing he could think to say. "Idle hands invite sin," Ezra replied. "The Lord commanded this work, and they obey." Vance stayed for 2 hours. He noticed that the daughters didn't speak unless Ezra asked them a direct question. He noticed that they ate at their looms, not at a table. He noticed that when one of them coughed, the others didn't look up, and Ezra didn't seem to hear it. Before he left, Vance found a moment alone with Mercy. Ezra had stepped outside to fetch water, and the preacher approached the oldest daughter at her loom. He spoke softly. "Are you well, Miss Calloway?" Mercy's hands didn't stop moving. She looked at him for only a second, and he saw something in her face that he couldn't name. It wasn't fear. It was older than fear. "By the Lord's grace," she said. It was the only safe answer. Vance heard the flatness behind it, but he was a traveling man. He had no authority in this hollow. He had no evidence of crime, only the unease that any sensitive person would feel in that room. He left the next morning with a bolt of cloth as payment. Whether he reported what he had seen, or whether he filed it away with the 1,000 other strange things he had witnessed in the mountains, no one ever knew. But the daughters knew. They understood what Vance's visit meant, and what it didn't mean. It meant that strangers could see the loom room and leave without acting. It meant that a man of God could stand in the doorway, feel the wrongness of the place, and still walk away. It meant that no one was coming to save them. Mercy understood this first. She had watched Vance's face when he looked at the room, and she had seen the recognition there. She had also seen the departure. And in the days that followed, she began to understand something that her father had never intended her to learn. If the world wasn't going to open the door, they would have to open it themselves, or break through the wall. After Vance left, a change began in the loom room. It was so gradual that Ezra didn't notice, and so quiet that it made no sound he could have heard. The daughters began to talk with their work. Weavers have always hidden messages in cloth. A single drop thread, a color shifted by one shade, a herringbone reversed. These are signatures that only another weaver can read. The daughters had spent their lives eliminating these flaws. Now they began to use them deliberately. Martha created the code. She assigned meanings to specific variations. A herringbone shift meant tonight. A single drop thread in the selvage meant watch him. A color change from indigo to navy meant yes. A warp thread pulled tighter than the others meant danger. They practiced in scraps, in sections of cloth that Ezra would never sell. They tested each other until they could read a message from across the room without looking up from their own frames. The language was crude, limited to a dozen signals, but it was enough. For the first time in 15 years, the daughters could communicate without Ezra knowing. Mercy became the leader, not by vote, because they never voted. Not by declaration, because declarations were forbidden. She became the leader because she was the oldest, and because she had been the one who told Vance, by the Lord's grace, while her eyes said something else entirely. She began to coordinate the code, to assign watchers, to collect information. Ezra took laudanum for the pain in his joints. He bought it from a peddler who came through twice a year, and he measured it into a brown bottle that he kept on a shelf in the main cabin. The laudanum made him sleep deeply, and it made his hands shake in the mornings. Mercy counted the doses by watching the level in the bottle. She noticed that he drank 2 full dippers of well water before bed, and that his sleep was heaviest on Sunday nights after his longest sermons. They watched his habits the way they watched a draft pattern, looking for the repeats and the breaks. They noted that he never checked the loft after locking the door, because the lock was enough for him. They noted that he kept the willow switch by the door, but never carried it with him when he walked to the main cabin. Leah, who hummed while she worked, began to hum tunes their mother had sung. The other daughters recognized them, though they couldn't have named them. The tunes passed between the looms like the code in the cloth, another language that Ezra couldn't hear. Ruth's cough grew worse as the weather turned, but she didn't ask for rest, because rest was no longer the point. They were no longer weaving for Ezra's God. They were weaving for each other, and the cloth they produced was only the visible part of a larger pattern that was taking shape in the space between their minds. By November, Ezra's health had begun to fail. His hands swelled around the knuckles until he couldn't close his fingers into a fist. He installed a 9th loom for himself near the door, but he couldn't work it for more than an hour before the pain forced him to stop. The loom stood empty most days, and the daughters could feel his frustration in the air like a charge before a storm. His temper shortened. Where he had once corrected errors with measured strokes of the willow switch, he began to strike harder and more often. He accused the daughters of sabotaging the cloth, of ingratitude toward the God who had provided their consecration. The sermons grew darker. He read from the Old Testament now, the parts about destruction and judgment, and his voice rose until it cracked. On the 3rd Sunday of November, Ezra preached for 3 hours. The daughters sat on their stools while he walked between the looms, his voice rising and falling. When the sermon ended, he told them to resume weaving. Abigail, the youngest at 16, had developed a headache that pressed behind her eyes like a thumb. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and let her shuttle rest in her lap. Ezra saw it, and he crossed the room in 4 strides without reaching for the willow switch. He picked up a wooden shuttle from the nearest loom, the tool that weighed as much as a hammer, and he struck her across the shoulder with it. The sound was different from the switch. It was heavier, more solid, like wood striking wood. Abigail cried out and fell from her stool. He struck her again, across the back, and then a third time before Mercy rose from her loom and said, "Father." The single word stopped him. Mercy had never spoken to him without being spoken to first. She stood between her loom and his shadow, and she looked at him with the same flatness she had shown Silas Vance. "The cloth," she said. "You'll stain it." Ezra looked down at Abigail, curled on the floor with her arm held against her chest. He looked at the shuttle in his hand. Then he walked to the door and hung the shuttle back on its peg. He told Mercy to clean the girl up and get her back to work. Then he left the barn, and the daughters heard the door slam behind him. Abigail's collarbone was broken. They could feel the sharp edge of it beneath her skin when they lifted her to the loft. Ezra's solution, delivered the next morning, was that she would sit on a stool in the loom room and learn from watching the others until she healed. She wouldn't be permitted to stay in the loft during working hours. She would sit where he could see her, and she would watch. This was worse than a beating. He was showing them what happened to broken tools. Abigail sat on her stool with her arm bound against her chest, and she watched her sisters work, and she didn't cry. But something hardened in her face that had still been soft before, and the older daughters saw it, and they recognized it. The plan didn't come from any single mind. It grew in the space between the looms, fed by the code in the cloth and the silence that followed Ezra's sermons. It took shape the way a pattern takes shape on a frame, one thread at a time, until the image is too clear to ignore. The catalyst was the bed. Ezra slept in the main cabin, in a room that no daughter had ever entered. The bed was the center of that room, the one piece of furniture he treated with reverence. He had built it himself from oak and rope, and he had sewn the mattress from ticks stuffed with corn husks and wool scraps. It was the only place where he removed his boots or unbuttoned his collar. It was his sanctuary, his altar, the one space in the hollow where he wasn't the patriarch, or the taskmaster, or the prophet. He was just a man with swollen joints and a bottle of laudanum, lying down in the dark. The daughters knew this because they had watched him through the window. Over the years, each of them had passed the main cabin at dusk or dawn and seen him through the glass. They had watched him sit on the edge of the mattress with his head in his hands. They had watched him pour the laudanum into a tin cup and drink it like water. They had watched him lie back and pull the wool blanket up to his chin, and they had seen the stillness that followed. Martha made the connection first, though she didn't say it aloud. She was practicing a repair stitch on a scrap of torn muslin, threading a needle with the heavy linen cord that Ezra used for sailcloth, and she looked at the needle in her hand and thought of the mattress. She thought of how many stitches it would take to bind a man to his own bed. She thought of how many hands could hold him while other hands worked. She thought of the cord, strong enough to hold a sail against a storm, strong enough to hold anything. She didn't speak her thought. She passed the scrap to Naomi, and Naomi looked at the stitches, and then Naomi passed it to Mercy. The scrap moved around the room like a shuttle, invisible to Ezra, who was occupied with his own pain. By the time it returned to Martha, all 7 daughters had seen it, and none of them had spoken, and the decision had been made without a word. They practiced, they used scraps of muslin and old rags, and they timed themselves. They learned to tie the knots that Ezra had taught them for securing bolts of cloth for transport. They discovered that 7 women, working in practiced coordination, could bind a rolled mattress to a frame in less than 3 minutes. They calculated that if they started with his nightshirt, pinning the fabric to the sheet beneath him, they could create anchor points that he wouldn't feel until he tried to move. They figured out that his laudanum sleep was deep enough that he wouldn't wake until the needle entered his skin, and by then it would be too late. They didn't vote or pray over it, because both actions would have required words they no longer trusted. They simply continued weaving the next morning, their hands moving in the old rhythm, their minds working in the new one. The code in the cloth changed. The signals became simpler, more direct. A single tight thread in the selvage now meant only one thing: soon. December in the hollow was a season of stillness. The creek froze at the edges, and the ridge held snow that didn't melt for weeks. On the night of December 14th, 1882, the temperature dropped below 0, and the main cabin's wood stove burned low because Ezra had forgotten to feed it. He takes extra laudanum that night because his joints ache in the dry cold, and he measures the dose with a hand that shakes so badly he spills some on the floor. He drinks the rest from his tin cup, and he pours a second dipper of well water, and he carries both to his room. His boots come off by the bed. His collar is unbuttoned. The wool blanket is pulled up to his chin. His breathing deepens until it becomes the sound of the room, a slow rhythm that replaces the absent looms. He doesn't hear the barn door open. He doesn't hear 7 pairs of feet cross the frozen clearing, their steps muffled by rags they have tied around their shoes. He doesn't hear the main cabin's door swing inward, because Naomi has oiled the hinges with fat from the stove. Mercy enters first. She has a candle shielded inside a tin can so the light doesn't escape through the window. The flame is small, no larger than a fingertip, but it shows her what she needs to see. Ezra is lying on his back with his mouth open. The laudanum has done its work. His hands rest on his chest like the hands of a corpse already prepared for burial. She tests him. She speaks his name, softly, the way she has heard him speak their mother's name in his sleep. Ezra. There's no response, and his breathing doesn't change. She speaks it again, louder, and still he doesn't move. The daughters wait in the doorway, and they watch, and they don't speak because speech is no longer necessary. They have planned this the way they plan a complex weave. Each daughter assigned a position, each hand assigned a task. Ruth and Esther move to the head of the bed, while Leah and Martha take the sides, and Naomi and Mercy kneel at the foot. Abigail, her arm still bound against her chest, stands by the door with a pillow in her good hand. They have less than 5 minutes. Ezra's sleep is deep, but it isn't death, and death is the only thing they can count on to wait. They start with the mattress, using the heavy linen cord meant for sailcloth to pass thread beneath the bed frame and up through the rope supports, binding the mattress to the wood beneath it. This is the foundation. If the mattress can move, he can roll. If the mattress is fixed, he is fixed with it. Their hands work in the dark, guided by touch and memory, and the knots are tight before he takes his next breath. Then they move to the sheets. Ezra wears a nightshirt of unbleached cotton that falls to his knees. The daughters have threaded needles with the same cord they used on the mattress, and they begin to stitch the nightshirt to the sheet beneath him. The first pass goes through the hem of the shirt and into the fabric of the bed, and the needle makes a soft sound as it enters, a sound like a thread being pulled through a loom. Ezra doesn't react. The laudanum holds him in its depth. They work their way up his body. The stitches are small, invisible from more than a foot away, but each one is an anchor. They stitch the sleeves to the sheet beside him, pinning his arms. They stitch the hem of the nightshirt across his shins, pinning his legs. They work quickly, without speaking, their hands moving in the rhythm they have practiced since childhood, the rhythm of the loom transferred to a new frame. He wakes when the needle enters his palm. It's an accident. Martha is stitching the cuff of his sleeve, and her hand slips in the darkness, and the needle goes deeper than she intended, through the cotton and into the skin between his thumb and forefinger. Ezra's eyes open, and he draws breath to scream, but Abigail presses the pillow across his face before the sound can leave his throat. The scream is muffled by the wool, and it becomes a vibration in the mattress, a tremor that the daughters feel through their knees. He thrashes, but the stitches hold. His arms move 6 inches and stop, caught by the threads that bind his sleeves to the sheet. His legs kick, but the hem is stitched across his shins, and the kicks only pull the sheet tighter. He tries to roll, but the mattress is lashed to the frame, and the roll becomes a twist that exposes his back to the cold air. The daughters don't stop. They have rehearsed this in their minds 1,000 times, and the rehearsal holds where their courage might have failed. While Abigail keeps the pillow pressed across his face, the others continue stitching. They stitch the sheet to the mattress at his waist, at his chest, at his throat. They use the surgeon's knots they learned from their mother, the knots that don't slip, the knots that hold until they're cut. His strength is fading because the laudanum is still in his blood, and the struggle is burning it faster than his body can manage. His movements slow until the thrashing becomes twitching, and the twitching becomes stillness. Abigail keeps the pillow in place for a count of 60, her broken collarbone screaming with the pressure, and then she lifts it away. Ezra Calloway is breathing, but barely, as the wool blanket has drawn a film of condensation across his face, and his chest rises and falls in shallow movements that seem mechanical, almost voluntary. But he cannot move his arms or his legs, and he cannot turn his head more than an inch before the stitching at his throat pulls him back. He's sewn into his own bed with the same precision he demanded from their cloth, and the daughters have become the weavers of a new kind of bolt. Mercy stands back. She looks at what they have made. The candle flame gutters in the tin can, and the shadows move across the walls, and for a moment the room looks like the loom house, the frames and the threads and the women standing in the half-light. But the frame is a bed, and the weft is a man, and the pattern is one that no merchant in 3 counties would have recognized. She turns to her sisters without speaking, and she picks up the empty laudanum bottle from the floor and sets it on the windowsill. Then she walks to the door, and the others follow her, and they cross the frozen clearing back to the barn. They climb the ladder to the loft. They lie down on their pallets, and they listen to the silence of the hollow, a silence that is no longer full of looms. Dawn comes late in December. When the light finally crosses the ridge and enters the barn through the high windows, the loom room is empty for the first time in 18 years. The looms stand in their places, the half-finished bolts still threaded, the shuttles resting in their races. The stove is cold, the willow switch hangs from its peg by the door. In the main cabin, Ezra Calloway is still breathing. The daughters know this because Naomi checked. She rose before the others and walked across the clearing in the gray half-light, and she looked through the window of his room and saw the condensation on the blanket, still rising and falling. She didn't enter. She didn't speak to him. She simply confirmed that he was alive, and she returned to the barn, and she told the others what she had seen. They sit in the main cabin now, all 7 of them, around the table where Ezra ate his meals alone. They have spent 18 years in a world where every action was commanded, and now there are no commands, and the absence feels like a new kind of pressure. No one rings the bell. The hollow is silent. The ridge holds its snow, and the daughters understand, gradually, that no one is coming. No sheriff has been summoned. No neighbor has noticed the silence. The world beyond the ridge continues exactly as it has always continued, indifferent to the fact that 7 women have stopped weaving. Mercy walks back to the barn in the late morning. She enters the loom room, and she stands among the frames, and she picks up a shuttle from the nearest loom. She holds it in her hand, feeling the weight of it, the smooth wood worn by 18 years of passing. She looks at the half-finished bolt on the frame, the thread still stretched and waiting. She could sit down. She could continue the pattern. She knows exactly where to begin. She sets the shuttle back in its race without sitting, and she walks to the door, and she steps outside into the clearing, and she looks up at the ridge for the first time in 15 years without the fear that she's inviting damnation. The sky is gray, and the air is cold, and the trail that leads up the slope is covered with snow. But it's still there. It's always been there. And now she knows that she can walk it whenever she chooses. The others join her, one by one. They stand in the clearing, 7 women in stained dresses, and they look at the hollow that has been their prison and their home. They don't speak of what they did to Ezra. They don't speak of what they will do tomorrow. They simply stand together, and they breathe, and they listen to a silence that is no longer full of sounds too faint for strangers to hear. It's full of nothing at all, and nothing, they're learning, is a sound that takes practice to recognize. The loom room still stands in the hollow, or so the story goes. Some say you can still hear the shuttles on cold December nights, though no one has lived there for 40 years. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the Voice of the Hollow. The mountains are full of secrets that never found their way into history books. There's another hollow, another family, another silence. We'll be back soon.